As we head into a new year, it is now more important than ever to discuss the topics and utilize the tools that will move our Jewish community forward.
We're still connected.
Time to say goodbye to 2020.
Groups that we share the same values with.
Experiencing on your own terms.
Connecting through Judaism.
You show up because this matters.
You feel a part of something.
A series of inspiring events leveraging the leadership of Bay Area community builders, philanthropists, rabbis, academics, and professionals. People just like us who are working to make our local communities safe, equitable, and resilient.
Welcome everyone to the Day of Philanthropy Festival. It's great to have you here. I'm Marc Dollinger, a Jewish Studies professor at San Francisco State University, a member of Federation's board, and moderator for today's panel, Changing the System, Jewish Philanthropy, Racial Justice, and What We Need to Know. Since the murder of George Floyd last May, many of us have dedicated ourselves to learning about how systemic racism informs our country and our Jewish community. Today, our panelists will share their knowledge and experiences, offering us ways we can help make a difference in our giving. We welcome three of the most illuminating national voices on this subject. Paula Pretlow earned her bachelor's and master's degrees from Northwestern University before embarking on a career in finance that led eventually to the role of senior vice president of the Capital Group, a $2.1 trillion investment management firm. Among her many boards, Paula represents her alma mater, Northwestern University, as well as Congregation Emmanuel here in San Francisco. Today, we will focus on her role as a member of the board of the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, a Baltimore-based philanthropy that allocates $130 million a year to fight poverty. Barry Finestone serves as the first ever president and CEO of the Jim Joseph Foundation, a San Francisco-based Jewish education philanthropy that has dispersed about $500 million in the last decade. Barry got his start in his native Glasgow, Scotland, with a degree in community education from Jordan Hill College. Here in San Francisco, he has served as CEO of our JCC, as well as the executive director of the Lisa and John Pritzker Family Fund. In all his free time, he also stepped up to lay leadership, having served now as past president of the Jewish Community High School of the Bay. Ilana Kaufman envisions an active and engaged Jewish community that counts all of our diversity as vital to Jewish life. As founder and executive director of the Jews of Color Initiative, Ilana centers and amplifies stories that can lift us all. She earned her bachelor's degree in sociology from Humboldt State University and a master's in educational pedagogy from Mills College. In her earlier professional life, Ilana joined the team at the San Francisco Federation before she directed public affairs and civic engagement in the East Bay for our JCRC. After today's panel, please check out her Eli talk, Who Counts? Race and the Jewish Future. And I must add that in my own scholarly and educational work, Ilana has been my teacher, my editor, and my guide. In preparation for today, our panelists have been reflecting on their own racial justice journeys, both professionally and personally. As they share, please send any questions you have in the Q&A feature on Zoom. We'll get to as many as time allows. In order to help keep us all focused on one conversation, we've decided to disable the chat feature today. We'll go to Ilana first to share a useful framing device for our conversation and for our work as philanthropists. Ilana, could you explain the 4 Ps that you developed?
Great. So I want you to think about power. And the way I want you to think about power is, when do you have it and when do you not have it? Where do you have to react to power, and when and where do you get to be the action around power? How do you have a sense of how much you have relative to the context, and what do you need to know about with whom you're interacting to really understand your relationship to power? I want you to think about privilege, and I want you to think about privilege in terms of what's been earned and what's been unearned, privileges that you have that are assumed. I also want you to think about that unearned privilege and wonder whose labor or whose resources or whose support did I have to leverage to accumulate that unearned power? And do I have to go back and make some repair there? I want you to think about pace, who gets to set it, who gets to interrupt it, who has to keep up with pace, and how do you think about pace in relationship to the work that you're getting done? And finally, I want you to think about proximity. Your proximity to roles of influence, your proximity to roles and experiences of authority, your proximity to setting and maintaining boundaries. And these are not so much definitions of power and privilege, pace, or proximity. There are ways to think about them and apply them to how we think about the work of justice. I also want to add that these 4 frames are related to the actual work you're doing. Are you engaging in the work of racial justice? Are you engaging in the work of being anti-racist? Are you engaging in the work about being a multiracial, multi-ethnic community? And how does the action that you're engaging in around equity inform the work that you're doing? I finally want to say, why does this matter? It matters because each one of us is somewhere on a continuum as related to power, to privilege, to proximity, and to pace. And that continuum means we have both the elements of access to resources and power, but also the other side of what it means to be on the side of being marginalized or having to rely on others to advance ourselves or for privilege. And again, when we're thinking about this through the lens of philanthropy, understanding that the outcome of our work, when we think about power, privilege, pace, and proximity, and then when we intersect that with racial justice, anti-racism, and a multiracial reality, the outcome of our work should and will look different.
Thank you so much, Ilana. That's outstanding, not only for our attendees, I think also to frame our discussion today. Maybe I'm sort of channeling a lot of the attendees today. There is a whole lot of interest now among white Jews to bring Jews of color into their organizations, onto their boards, into their giving process. I can only imagine how many times you get that call. When you do, what goes through your mind? What are the dynamics at play? What do we need to know?
I want to first thank you for inviting me onto this panel. It is a privilege to be working with you, Marc, and as always with my buddies, Barry and Ilana, it's a gift to be able to serve on this panel and be in discussion with you. I'd like to continue the definitions, and I'd like to start with equity. What is equity? Equity is defined, I'm going to read this so that I get it precisely, so that we all get it precisely. Equity is defined as the state, the quality, or ideal of being just, impartial, and fair. The concept of equity is synonymous with fairness and justice. Now, equity is often conflated with equality. Equality means sameness. True equity implies an individual may need or experience something different. In other words, not equal, in order to maintain fairness. So that we all have a base from which to come to this discussion. I just wanted to put that out there as my definition, but it's backed up by doing a little research and coming up with what I think we can all agree with. Now, Marc, you asked what goes through my mind when I get a call, and privilege goes through my mind, power goes through my mind, pace goes through my mind, proximity goes through my mind. The 4 Ps go through my mind. What also goes through my mind is, wow, I must be having some kind of impact that people recognize my name and my work, and they figure I have value to add. So I come at those calls, or when I receive those calls, with feeling very privileged and very fortunate to get the call. And I feel that those calls are coming from a place that that organizations and people want to do better, want to be better, and figure that there is some way that I might be able to help. Now, dynamics is another word I'd like to define, because dynamics is defined as the forces which stimulate growth, development, or change within a system or process. So that plays right into when I get the call. Why? I figure it's because people, organizations want to make a change and they feel that I can add to it. Whether that is true or not, it's how I receive it. I've been having a lot of discussions lately with mentees and people in general about this idea of tokenism, and even challenging that I may be asked because I'm a token. I'll go back, just personal experience. When I grew up in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, as a child in the 60s, my mother decided that she would use her 5 children to desegregate the Oklahoma City public schools. So I have often been an only or one of the few. The idea of tokenism, not my problem to deal with. If that is how somebody else is viewing me, that's their issue. I walk into any room because I learned very early on, it is how I view myself. And I walk into a room and sit at a table with the belief that I have something to add. And if I'm chosen because I'm a token or represent a token, I don't go in with that attitude. So I figure I'm there to make a contribution, and that's my job, and that is what I do. And I think that attitude, that I am there for a reason, my reason, I was asked for a good reason, assuming people are coming from the right place. If I'm wrong about that, that's their problem to get over and to solve. And I'll stop there, but that's a beginning, Mark.
Yeah, thank you so much. And the burden of tokenism, rests solely in, those of us who are tokenizing, to be sure. One of the dynamics that come up, and I think a challenge around, racial justice and philanthropy, is it all seems so well intentioned, and it seems as if nobody really is intending on engaging in tokenism or doing that. So I'll open the conversation to Ilana and Barry as well. When you're hearing sort of Paula's experience, how is it landing on you, and what are you thinking about on these dynamics? And maybe Ilana, we can start with you.
First of all, I so appreciate Paula's approach, and it reflects, a voice of experience and strategy as we navigate spaces of power to create bridges to advance equity. I think it's really important to have an awareness about tokenism versus representation, and we're lucky when colleagues like Paula can hold the space and focus on the work, recognizing that we might be an only one or a few of an only one. And I would also push our colleagues out there to beyond sort of reaching for the first person of color. And please let me clarify, this is not in relation to what Paula said, but when there's an impulse to diversify a board or diversify a committee, and our first impulse is to sort of reach for the nearest person of color, we have to also ask ourselves, is this going to be a great match? We have to ask ourselves, is it going to advance an equity perspective? We have to ask ourselves if we're going to ask this person to blend into our context, if our context is going to advance and evolve into one that really is multiracial and kind of multi-identity. And then the final piece is we have to appreciate that people have different experiences and different perspectives and different approaches to work. And when we're truly creating environments that are both multiracial and equitable, there's not only space for the diversity of who we are, but the diversity of how we show up. The point, that the central anchor is that we are all excellent in the work that we do. But the next iteration of our community is one where we can all be whole and who we are and be brilliant at the same time.
Thank you, Barry. I've actually got a follow-up question specifically for you, but before I get to that, just if you have any thoughts or reactions to what you've heard.
Yeah, well, again, I'll just take the opportunity to add the thanks to the Federation and to you, Mark, and to Ilana and Paula. It's also a good excuse for me to put on a collared shirt for the first time in an awful long time. So my wardrobe thanks you. Yeah, I mean, just on this piece, the question, and I think, Paula and I have had some discussions in the past, the tokenism question is a really interesting one, or the point. And I think for me, and I do also want to preface that I think, some of what I might say today is going to be similar to what Ilana said, which is partly a personal perspective and also partly a professional perspective in my very privileged role as here at the foundation. And I think the kind of the red flag around tokenism for me is really around what else is happening within the organization. In other words, is it checking a box and therefore, having a person on a board or on a committee, regardless of the skill set, even if the person is totally skilled, it seems to me that seems to me to be a little bit tokenistic, and understanding what else the organization might be doing in the field of racial justice and in other fields related to different arenas of diversity and equity and inclusion. That seems to me to be a good frame that we try to look at it here at the foundation, and I think myself as an individual tries to look at it in that regard.
All right, so Bear, I'm going to follow up with you and certain ask Ilana and Paula if you want to comment as well. The question is, whose job is it? And literally, we're talking about diversifying boards and bringing racial equity, and specifically around philanthropy and giving. So this notion that a foundation, a fund, or even individual donors want to have greater racial equity in their work, and they're immediately going to reach out, right, to the nearest Jew of color that they're going to bring into their process. However, as you see it, Barry, whose job is it from an organizational perspective to bring racial equity when you are considering welcoming Jews of color into power?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a few things that I would say. I mean, first of all, I think in any organization, it comes from a place of overall leadership, and it also comes from a place of an understanding of what the goals are of your organization and how you want to fulfill them. And so, I mean, I think the best way for me to answer the question is just to very briefly talk about, kind of like day one here at the foundation, at least for me, back some, 4 years ago, where we began a process of understanding where we wanted to go strategically and started to work pretty robustly over a period of 1 or 2 years about what that plan would look like. We drew on, major secular influences for that, around this particular issue, particularly the issue of diversity. And we know research everywhere tells us, from, all across the world that, culturally diverse teams have the potential to be more creative and deliver better results. That is a proven scientific data, data fact. That there's that piece. And then as we finished our strategy work, we actually created a statement that said, and I'm going to read as well here, Jewish learning and the Jewish community will be richer when our leaders, educators, and participants reflect the full diversity of today's Jewish population. There's important work to be done to address a range of diversity, equity, and inclusion to keep this objective. So some of it begins with a statement from the organization, and then boards and staff have to be held accountable to that, to that statement. And then one other kind of practical thing is, in the foundation world, there's an awful lot of talk about outputs and outcomes. And if in fact you are stating that that is one of your goals, then you actually have to test and data for it to make sure that you are over a period of time. You can't just state it. So it's not just about, in the past, the Jim Joseph Foundation might ask a question about how many young Jews did organization A engage in a particular year. That's a good question to ask, but now we need to be asking a set of other questions that are related to our strategy. How many of these are Jews of color? How many of these are LGBTQ kids, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's the kind of the dual side of strategy and implementation that need to marry into one another, or else I think they become empty words, and then it becomes tokenistic. And then the last thing I would just say, I'm really drawn to the commentary of the 4 Ps. And I just can't say enough of the fact that in my own personal journey here, I can read all sorts of articles and all sorts of news reports and have my own personal thoughts. But being proximate on a learning journey with people who are in this space has undoubtedly been and is still in the educating factor for me. I am at Racial Justice 101, guys, right? I am moving through, and my teachers are on this panel and other people. And they're helping to inform my thoughts and allows me to create my own thoughts. And getting proximate is I think, immensely crucial before the implementation of the work of philanthropy.
Thank you. So Paula, thank you for sort of setting us up on this notion of the complexity around power and privilege to get embodied, to be brought in to teach and be a part, of racial equity, and in this case in philanthropy, against the hidden and not so hidden dangers that can bring. As you're sort of hearing your colleagues, any thoughts or reactions to what you've heard?
My colleagues are experts, and they bring out even more from this idea of, well, why would Paula Pretlow be asked? Why aren't more and others? We're all on this learning journey together. And I feel that because I am in this privileged position, I got here because of the work I have done throughout my life and throughout my career, both in business and in nonprofit work and in philanthropy. I got here by working hard, by listening, and by being interested. And we're all on this learning journey. What we can do, and what is part of my job, is to make sure that there are others who are being lifted up and whose a light is being shined on them as well as leaders, and that the well is deep. And we can't just always go to the same well and take the water that's on the top. We have to look beneath the surface and understand and know and take the chance, take the bet on those rising stars, if you will, people who are interested, who want to learn, but who just haven't had the networks or the mentors or the interest of others in bringing them along. I view that as very much a part of the work that I do, so that it is my contribution to this idea of tokenism being erased over time, because we can't survive with this idea that there's only one or two and that's it, because it's just a false assumption.
That's great, thank you. And I actually want to follow up on my next question with Barry on this notion of individual versus systemic. But first, just wanted to check in with Ilana and see if you have anything you wanted to add at this moment.
Just one quick thought to connect with Paul and Barry, which is that, part of the dynamic of tokenism is also assuming that because we're Black or because we're a woman or because we're queer, we have just kind of, it's a bifurcated structure where we're just disadvantaged or underprivileged, and we have nothing to bring to the table and to the equation. And it's much more about each one of us has both privileges and an absence of privileges, depending on what our context is, depending on the setting and depending on what's going on. And so it's about calibrating to each of those settings around power, pace, proximity, but it's about calibrating our understanding to say, like, okay, like Ilana or any leader, we want to bring you into this project because you have these skills, and having also the capacity to say, and here's what we need to be successful, and also recognizing that an entity has both a lot of assets and also a lot of needs. And so if we can also get into relationship, which is part of the proximity piece that Barry's talking about, if we can actually get into relationship and talk and teach and learn with one another, it becomes much more dynamic and much more about interdependence than us depending on one piece, but not recognizing the nature of our interconnectedness.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to just express gratitude, appreciation to our panelists for your trust, for your vulnerability, as we're diving in. And in that spirit, Barry, let's name both racial and gender power dynamics that are at play in this very moment. And I think is a metaphor for Jewish philanthropy, racial justice, and equity as well. As a white man, you stepped into one of the most power-filled roles in all of Jewish philanthropy. Now, this gives you perhaps unprecedented opportunity to help bring racial justice and equity to American Jewish education. That's the good news. It also reflects the privilege enjoyed by white men in senior leadership, as well as the limitations we, as white men, face in our own understanding and our own consciousness about systemic racism. So, as you've been reflecting on your career overall, certainly at the Jim Joseph Foundation, looking at the notion of each of us as individuals and the privileges we have against the systems that I think all of us in philanthropy are trying to change, how do you navigate, or how have you wrestled with that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question and appreciate you naming it. And I'll just say straight out that hopefully not the current gig that I have, but I think there's at least a job or two that I've had in my prior career where certainly being a man and being a white man was probably very advantageous to me getting the role. And that clearly is something that is. That it's taken us a long time to get to this point, and it's going to take us a long time to get out of this point, but we have to start. Look, I think, this is a place where I think the foundation and its approach has actually been very instructive and helpful to me. And when I say the foundation and its approach, I'm meaning systems that I inherited, which is that we're very focused on national things. We're very focused on systemic change. And so when we look at things that we fund over the long term, we tend to pick, national partners. In this particular arena, as we delved into this arena of Jews of color in the education space and in the Jewish world, there was no place. Right, and I think that's just an interesting thing to understand in of itself. Right, there were multitudes of individuals doing really amazing work, and so the fact that Ilana is the head of the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative, and I think that the word "building" here is really, really important, is an effort that the Jim Joseph Foundation and a number of wonderful funding partners who are on this call really said, this is something we're here to stay. This is a moment in time, right? And we're not going away, and we're not going to just try and check a box, as I like to say. And having said that, yes, I am a white man in a very in a job that has that has an awful lot of power. And I believe, again, this is also something that I credit my predecessors, both lay and professional, at the Jim Joseph Foundation and the current team, which is we try and approach it with a degree of humility. We try and approach all of our philanthropy with a degree of with tremendous humility. And I would say this one on steroids. Right, and it's about it's really about relationships. So now, and I don't want to embarrass them, but I would say that in the last 12, 18 months, Paula, Ilana, and I, and some others have had multiple conversations, kind of off the record, on the side, just talking and learning and working with one another. And that has made, has built a level of trust that I think is, wonderful and incredible, that allows us to agree and to disagree and to understand and to push and to pull. But we're actually having real and honest conversations about it all. And, again, some of this is about practical things for philanthropy. And I believe that being in relationship and being proximate is ultimately the most important thing. And I also will pick up on Ilana's P about the pace again and just say, there's no magic to the pace. But if it happens really quickly, you're not doing it right. I'm convinced of that, because again, it took us a long time to get here, and it's going to take us a long time to get out of here.
All right, we're going to go to Ilana next. I'm just going to go with the assumption that the overwhelming majority of our attendees are white Jews and are here because they're trying to learn and figure out how they can help achieve greater racial equity in their philanthropy. And sort of Barry's comments from where he's sitting, maybe resonating with them as they are eager to bring change, yet maybe aware or unaware of the extent to which the power and privilege dynamics around race and gender to start, orientation, we can make the list, come into play. So I'd be, curious not only in your reactions to the topic or to what Barry said, but even more specifically, what can you say to those of us who are attendees now and who have a really heartfelt desire to bring change and are either in the midst of navigating power and privilege or really are hearing about this for the first time? So maybe Ilana, we can start with you.
Thank you. So first, I just want to say, colleagues of color out there, I see you on my left hand or my right hand of the screen. They've disabled my chat feature, or I would have given you a shout out. And so I just want to acknowledge that among the hundreds of folks, I see you out there. So first of all, trust is really, really important. And I just want to say establishing trust in this context is really, really hard, because I think what foundations need to remember and well-established funds need to remember is, particularly if it's a US-centric fund or foundation, I don't think the question is like, to what extent has racism and white supremacy informed our fund or foundation? I think the question is, to what extent has racism and white supremacy not informed our foundation and not infused everything we do with racism? And what I mean by that is, I don't think we should get alarmed and excited that that racism and white supremacy are in the DNA of our foundations and our funds and our organizations, because it's in the air we breathe, right? Like it's by a process of osmosis, if nothing less. What we need to get excited and vigilant about is the impact of racism and white supremacy on our work. And we can't begin to explore that in any kind of safe way until we acknowledge that it's real, that it's in the air that we breathe, and that it harms all of us, Jews of color, people of color, and white folks included. But it harms us differently, and it gets in our way differently, and it compromises our capacity to be excellent and be whole differently. And so if we're not interrogating our systems and wondering about it, what we need to assume is, if we have colleagues of color in our space, if we want to grow philanthropists and fund leaders who are Jews of color, we first have to protect ourselves and protect each other, and then protect our colleagues from essentially what is like racial abuse, which is existing in a system of racism that's been unchecked and uninterrogated for all of these years. And thank goodness we have colleagues who are taking this work really, really seriously. And I appreciate everybody who's out here, who's in this conversation, because you're curious, you're thinking hard about these questions, and that you care about the impact of racism. And we see it in reporting structures in foundations and funds. We see it in grant application structures. We see it in the way sometimes program officers speak to potential grantees. And we have an opportunity to restructure all of this. And it happens with some patience, but with a consciousness of the urgency of it. It happens with really intentional skill building and capacity deploying in our organizations. And it comes with an absolute understanding and acknowledgement that racism and white supremacy are real. If we haven't interrogated these ideas, particularly in the Jewish community, we must. And we have to appreciate that for many, many funds and foundations, and again, I don't say this in any kind of like heightened way, but the roots of the wealth also come from a process where either labor or resources were extracted in a way that was not sort of equitable. And having that conversations helps us grow, it helps us get honest, and it helps us get into deeper relationship with the tools and skills we need to advance the work on behalf of the Jewish community. Again, one that is both multiracial and multi-ethnic. And so this work is vitally important because our community already represents a reality that's not reflected inside of our organizations.
Thank you. Paula, what do you think?
Thank you for all of that. I think we have to begin, each and every one of us, by examining ourselves, asking ourselves tough questions, and being honest with ourselves. And as we are sitting at our tables, our philanthropy tables, our nonprofit tables, we have to decide that we're going to be vulnerable with one another and name these things and call them out. But to do so in a way that is advancing the goals and the mission of the organization. We can't be afraid to sit at a table and be afraid and not ask the question. We can't be afraid to ask questions, tough questions. So we need to come to some agreement as we're sitting around a table that we are going to operate in trust and vulnerability. And I can tell you with the Weinberg Foundation, part of that examination is for the entire staff, and the board will also be invited to go through racial equity training, not a one and done, because it isn't. It is a continual process, and it will take place over time for reinforcement. And so I would like to challenge those of us in the audience to do that, to break down to build up, and we will all benefit and be better for it.
Can I jump in for a second, Mark?
Please.
Yeah, I'm just resonating with Ilana's comments and Paula's response. And when I talked about the work of funding the field building initiative, I also want to be very clear that the very intentional work that happened and is happening and will continue to happen internally at this foundation, and I think many of the other funding partners, which speaks to Paula's point, which is, I would say that particularly with the events that have happened and transpired in our country in the last 12 months or so, I kind of have my wonderful professional colleagues banging at my door saying, we got to do more, we got to do this, we got to spend more, and it's all good. And at the same time, my response has been yes, and we have to go through our own journey here, right? And it's not a one and done, right? And so having speakers, having trainings, having understandings, over the last 18 months or so, we've probably gone through 4 or 5 different sessions. The pacing of these are quite intentional so that they don't lose their steam and their momentum, that we're not just dealing with it because it's an issue du jour, which I think is something that is very history. The Jewish community likes its big issues and attacks them and then kind of moves away from them. And this one needs to have legs, and therefore if it has to have legs, it needs to have, no pun intended, a strong foundation to them. So you actually have to have these conversations internally with program officers, with board members, with team members, to actually understand and uncover some of the biases and some of the other issues that Ilana, that Ilana discussed. Otherwise, the work that you're doing is both ill-informed and fundamentally not really meaningful. And I think that would be a big mistake.
Thanks so much. Ilana, I want to sort of, close off our questioning part to center the Jews of Color initiative and your work, and to center Jews of Color in this sense, literally and figuratively. And that's to say that in so many ways, the work you do at Jews of Color Initiative is combining so many of the dynamics and responsibilities and perspectives that we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, because on the one hand, you're like Paula and Barry. You've got money, you can give out grants, right? In terms of philanthropy. On the other hand, you've got to apply for grants. You have to go to people like Paula and Barry and ask for money so you can do your work to make the case. You're in both places simultaneously. So as you are navigating this, centering Jews of Color, how can we see the work of the Jews of Color initiative really as emblematic or a case study for all of this?
Oh, I love your question, and it's also very real. And I will just share with the colleagues, the audience who joined us, as when we were in our planning sessions for this call, Paula and I brought up together the reality that in this dynamic, one of us is not quite like the other in terms of the funders. And I was also testing out, like, would it be weird to be on a panel with Paula and Barry, given the sort of unique nature of the relationship? And so I just want to say, like, and that's an expression of this dynamic, which is both wanting to create spaces where we can be peers and be colleagues within a context where our work is embedded within a structure where there's just tremendous sort of structural imbalance. And so a couple of things I want to say. For me to do our work at the initiative requires me to be as strong and healthy as possible as a leader who's thinking about my own relationship to race and racism. Because I have questions I need to ask to have the initiative be successful. I need to advocate for our work, for our grantees, for our research, for Jews of color, and I need to be able to do that in a way where I have learning to do. I've never been a part of a team who's helped build a field before. And so not only do we need things like resources, but I need partnership. Sometimes I need information. Stephen Green at the Jim Joseph Foundation taught me how to do a beautiful budget with all of the bells and whistles that make me a strong participant in finance conversations. I didn't know how to do that before. And so part of it is requiring each one of us as leaders of color to be as whole and integrated as possible so that we can be confident in the capacities that we already bring to the work, but we might be shy when we think about this dynamic of power. So like you're seeing it right now, colleagues, where like I have to sort of balance my proximity with the power in this kind of dynamic. The other pieces that are really important are over time, because again, the relationship is essential. There has been both an openness from the side of the funders and an important sort of, I want to say, presentation of ideas. Sometimes it might be received as a little gentle nudging about how to make the work more equitable and purposeful for the purpose of whom we serve. And so, for example, we have a lot of funders at the initiative, and we're very grateful for the support. And you know what? If I wrote a single report for each one of those funders, you would never see me. We never do any work at the initiative. We'd just be writing reports all day long. And so I was able to have a conversation with our funders where I said, well, what would it be like if I aligned all of our reports, for example? And this might seem like a very, very kind of pedestrian example, but like the worship of the written word and the grants and philanthropy space is intense. And the desire to like write things and create numbers is intense and doesn't actually mean that we get good work done. And so how do we create standards of measurement and metrics that result in good work and elevate the leaders to do their work really well? How do we create opportunities to balance the intense dynamics of power with the beautiful dynamics of relationship and proximity? How do we model trust, but also take risks with trust, depending where you are on that continuum? And I'll end by saying at the end of the day, and I know this is not truly real, but it's part of what gives us some physics of forward motion. At the end of the day, I do not reach out to the funders thinking that there's a paucity of funds out there, right? Like there is no paucity of resources out there. There's a paucity of connections out there. There's a paucity of partnership out there. There's a paucity of trust out there. And it's only been reinforced by this racial reckoning that's happening in the last year. And so if we actually look at where there's scarcity and tended to the scarcity, instead of looking at where there are resources, we might be able to create stronger bridges, stronger relationships based on trust, and stronger outcomes for the whole community.
Thank you. First, if there's a brief, Barry or Paula response or reflection on that, please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just, yes. And I think, one of the other initiatives that the foundation has been involved in the last, 12 months has been the work around the JCRIF, the Jewish, Communal Response and Impact Fund. And a lot of the wise words that Ilana raised about making things easier and quicker and all of that on philanthropy. That's a whole other session about how philanthropy works and doesn't work in that regard, of which I tend to share an awful lot of Ilana's perspective. I wanted to just point out to all the to all the people in the audience here that the big foundation world, is obviously very crucial, and I get to the Jewish the Jewish community infrastructure, and I also want to just say though that the power is actually in the individual and in the individual philanthropist, and I want to be really clear about that. Over 70% of the dollars that circulate in the North American Jewish community, I think it's actually even greater, circulates not from the foundations, right? Yet that's the perception, right? The perception is that, Weinberg can do this and Jim Joseph can do that and, whatever. And clearly we are pieces of it. And the Jews of Color Initiative, pardon my reference to field building earlier on, there's too many acronyms and, but that's an important thing that actually, when you talk about that scarcity that Ilana just talked about, that's places where individual donors can very simply get in and deal with that scarcity. And some of the larger foundations perhaps are playing, again, at this larger, kind of initiative national level in order to bring about systemic change. And so there's an awful lot of power in private personal philanthropy, and I want to really encourage that.
Thanks so much. Paula, any thoughts?
Thank you both. I would be remiss if I didn't highlight one other thing as we are talking about equity, as we're talking about power. And this is directed particularly to foundations who invest their money to achieve a return from which those grants are then able to be made. Who's managing the money? Is that reflective of who and what you want or profess to be an equitable organization? Do you have people of color who are managing the money, providing returns? Because if you're not, I submit that you're not only doing a disservice, it's part of our fiduciary responsibility to achieve the highest returns. And by definition, you're not if you don't have a diversified portfolio. So that's one other thing that as an investment person, I'm compelled to point out. And I think the foundation and endowment world has a ways to go, but the first thing to do is to name it so that you recognize it, right?
Thank you. Thank you. We have so many extraordinary questions, of course. I'm going to pick one here to start. And it seems the most obvious and the biggest one, which is, we've been talking about Jewish philanthropy and racial equity in the Jewish world. How do you think about a work beyond the Jewish world, those allied, associated with Jews, those that have nothing to do with Jews? Where does concepts of racial equity and being Jewish play when we push the boundaries of what it is to be Jewish? Paula, you want to start us off?
Well, I have the good fortune and privilege to be able to have feet both in the Jewish world of philanthropy and also the world of finance and corporate boards. So I wear my Jewishness on my sleeve. I believe that my Jewish values that I bring into any room, be they in a Jewish room or in a corporate room, it's who I am, it's in my DNA, and it is my responsibility as a Jew to reflect those values in any room that I enter.
Thank you. Barry?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't have too much to add. Actually, I think that Paula's response kind of, covers mine. I mean, I will say that in our own internal kind of raising our levels of understanding and consciousness about issues of racism and bias, etc., we have gone out of the, we have gone out of the Jewish community for most of it, right? And I think that's a good thing. And frankly, I think that mirrors, that mirrors a belief that I have that in the Jewish community, in philanthropy and in other places too, we don't draw on secular expertise, so to speak. We somehow conclude that we're somehow different and, whatever. And while structurally that may be the case in the way that we're set up, from an expertise standpoint, there's just a tremendous amount to learn and, and gain.
Thank you. Ilana.
No, I think that's right on both what Paul and Barry said. And I would just sort of just rotate sort of the question and align with Barry's answer in a little bit different way, which is, as people of color who have a fund that serves in the Jewish community, we've had to leave the Jewish community where there are other Jews, right? So I also think like framing the context is very important. I would say our internal Jewish communal philanthropic space is probably the most rarefied and probably the least diverse racially, ethnically, communal philanthropic space I've ever sort of moved through. But when we leave this space, there are lots of Jews in other philanthropic communities and in other philanthropic environments. Think about the Donors of Color Network, for example, or the work that happens with John A. Powell up at UC Berkeley, or other resources. But I think it's very, very important to just appreciate that I don't want to call it a secular world because it's full of Jews. But the space outside of the Jewish communal philanthropic ecosystem, which is just very diverse, has been doing this work a lot longer than we have, with Jews and Jews of color and people of color and queer people and all kinds of people. There's pedagogy that's been designed. There are approaches that have been designed. There are tools that have been designed. There are ways of thinking and doing that we have to learn from and then bring them into our more rarefied environment. And as we bring them into our more rarefied environment, what happens is the walls become more porous and they start to crumble in all of the best ways. And sort of that integration between our rarefied space and the rest of us becomes more whole.
Thank you. If each of you could gift us with a vision by completing this sentence. When we bring a vision of racial justice and equity to our philanthropy, to our Jewish lives, and to all the people and communities around us, we will. Barry, why don't you start us off?
I mean, I would answer by saying we will be who we actually are, and not a slice of representation of who we actually are. And that, to me, is a fascinating journey to to be on, and not just an aspiration, but actually actually something that we must attain. Otherwise, I think we will be devaluing some of the major core concepts of the wisdom and tradition of our religion.
Thank you, Ilana. We will
have the capacity for people who we yet can't imagine to find their space, be whole, and thrive in the Jewish community. We will stop making frameworks for those of us who are already here, and we will develop the actual durable capacity for those who have yet to come.
Thank you. Paula, we will
lift up and accomplish even more than we originally envisioned.
Thank you for your time, for your expertise, and for your willingness to share your thoughts and yourselves with us. Thank you, Paula Pretlow. Thank you, Ilana Kaufman. Thank you, Barry Finestone, for teaching us today.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. It's been my privilege. Thank you, Mark.
And now we welcome our leader, Federation Board Chair Arthur Slepian, who has centered and amplified racial justice and equity as a key priority for all of us at Federation and beyond. Arthur.
Thank you, Mark. What an important conversation we have just heard. Thank you, Mark, for moderating. Thank you, Paula, Barry, and Ilana, for sharing your perspectives and your experiences and your wisdom in such insightful and inspiring ways. I'm Arthur Slepian. It's my honor to serve as chair of the board of the Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund. And I've spent much of the last year, and certainly much of the last hour for sure, thinking about my relationship to power, privilege, pace, and proximity. And I have a fair amount of all of those things. And I think the question in my mind is, what is the responsibility that comes with having those things? And I think as Ilana said, we need to do this work because the outcome looks different. It can't be about checking a box. It can't be about white Jews making themselves feel better. It has to be because there is real change that we want to see in the community. The outcome will look different. The outcome will look better. The outcome will make our community stronger. This has been such a timely conversation because this issue of racial justice and inclusion, it's extremely important to me personally and to all the leadership of the Federation. Last fall, we created a racial justice task force to advise the board and the leadership team as to how we best move forward as an organization on these issues in a meaningful way. I'm proud that Ilana is one of 8 Jews of color serving on this task force. I'm grateful to Marc for serving as a co-chair along with Lindsay Newman of Bechol Hashon. And we created this task force because we understood that to do this work of racial justice and equity well, we needed to bring Jews of color into the center of our conversations and our planning. Or as was said today, we need that proximity to those voices. And it's because we want as a federation to serve all the various populations that comprise our Bay Area Jewish community, including those that have historically been pushed to the margins. We want our professional staff and lay leadership to be representative of the full diversity of our community. And to do that work well, we need to both acknowledge and move through the often unspoken assumptions, biases, and customs that have gotten in our own way. As has been said today, we need to acknowledge what has been in the air that we breathe. This is going to be an important journey, sometimes a challenging one, likely a lengthy one. And I invite everyone on this call to find a way to join us. As our sages so wisely teach us, it is not upon us to finish the task, but neither are we free to desist from it. So what can you do? You can make a gift to support the Federation, including our work in diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. You can work to ensure that whatever other Jewish organizations you are involved in, that they are making racial equity a priority. And let me close with a few thank yous. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to everyone who has joined this program today. Thank you to all of our corporate sponsors, especially JP Morgan, the Seligman Family Foundation, and the Laura and Gary Lauder Family Venture Philanthropy Fund. And lastly, I want to invite all of you to join the next Day of Philanthropy Festival event. It's next week on Wednesday, February 17th, Moral Leadership in Imperfect Times with Jacqueline Novogratz, CEO of Acumen, in conversation with our Federation CEO, Danny Grossman. Thank you, and that concludes our program.